Welcome, everyone, to another edition of 45 Forward, where our mission is to help you, our listeners, from Los Angeles to Long Island, make your second half of life even better than the first. As we get older, one of the most important ingredients to healthy aging, experts tell us, is lifelong learning, a self-motivated pursuit of new ideas, skills, and knowledge, particularly in the second half of life. But today we're going to take a very different spin on lifelong learning as we take an in-depth look at a fascinating book called What Went Right? Lessons from Both Sides of the Teacher's Desk by Roberta Israeloff and George McDermott. Roberta, a lifelong writer, is currently the director of the nonprofit Squire Family Foundation, dedicated to encouraging the teaching of philosophy at pre-college levels. And George, a writer and poet, is a former teacher who had extensive editorial experience in several business and media fields over the course of his career. The two met in the late 1960s when George was a young English teacher at Syosset High School on Long Island. Roberta was one of his students, and so was I. Looking back, George and Roberta would recall their time at Syosset. One of us was a teacher, one of us was the student. Mostly what we did was argue. But when they found each other on social media several years ago, they began a steady correspondence that became a book relating their own lifelong learning experiences in America's public education system. I learned about their book through my long friendship with Roberta. After high school, we went on our separate ways to college, embarked on different careers and personal paths, but stayed in touch periodically over the years. I always look forward to our conversations. Roberta was warm, smart, funny, thoughtful, curious, also a terrific writer. I was especially intrigued when she told me her co-author was George McDermott, Mr. McDermott to me in high school, and perhaps not coincidentally, one of my favorite teachers who had a profound influence on my own career and view of education. The result of Roberta and George's collaboration is a provocative exchange about their perspectives over several decades, from inside and outside the classroom. Everything from their time as teachers, to the continuous debate over standardized testing, to the perennial questions about how education should prepare students to be human, to be discerning and productive citizens in a complex and increasingly divisive and unpredictable world. But it is also a story about what Roberta and George learned about themselves, what they remembered, how they reconnected, what went right and wrong, what changed over their lives, and what has remained the same, what endures. Today's conversation is part one of a unique three-part series that will continue in July and August. Now, originally, I had planned to have both Roberta and George on my show. Unfortunately, Roberta was called away. She had a sudden family crisis. But today, I'm fortunate to have George with me, and I hope that both Roberta and George will be back for subsequent conversations. But today, let's welcome George McDermott to the show. George, welcome.
Hi, thanks, Ron. It's good to see you again. Good to be here. Good to reconnect. Yes, and good to talk about what actually, one of the things that actually matters. Which is,
go ahead. Yeah.
Which is learning,
Yes.
And I mean, one of the problems that people have today is that they think they know. And when you think you know the answer, you stop looking for it.
Right.
And if you stop looking for it, you stop learning.
Right.
So that's sort of my take on what you were talking about lifelong learning.
Right, exactly. So before we dive into the book, George, let's talk a little bit about,
I'm sorry, I just hit a button that just took me out.
That's
sorry.
Okay. You're back. We're both back. So just as we start, I always like to start my shows with a little bit of for our audience about what our guests are like. Now they can find them about your biography on my website, royalresource.com. But tell me a little bit about your journey, because as we were saying before the show, former students like me often think like when they leave and go to college that their teachers we don't know what happens. They don't stay. No, they they have their own interesting and diverse lives. So tell me a little bit about just your career journey, and then we'll dive into the book.
I stayed with teaching for, I think, probably only a year or two after you were in my class. And I started, my wife and I started running out of money. Which is sort of a perennial problem for teachers. And Long Island is not, at least then, Long Island was not a really easy place to live for a person who was trying to live on a teacher's salary. So I left teaching. I didn't just leave Syosset. I left teaching, went into essentially marketing communications for a large company in Pennsylvania. And I did a lot of very bizarre things. I did things that I didn't even know existed, like industrial theater. I didn't know industrial theater existed.
Right.
But I did a lot of writing for that, and screenplays and audio and stuff. And eventually I wound up, leaving that job too, because of the downside, the wave of downsizing, and this company actually went into bankruptcy, I think, Chapter 11 for a while. And so I went back to teaching. Well, I freelanced for a while. Then I went back to teaching, and the two experiences were part of what led to my book with Roberta. That the teaching that I did in the second wave was in Center City, Philadelphia, and that was a whole different experience from the teaching in Syosset on Long Island.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that what I found about that for my interest was that I think that when you have a sort of a checkerboard career, I don't know if there's a better word for that, but basically it's not continuous. It does give you a certain perspective. I had sort of on a parallel note, in journalism, I sort of went in and out, and I think it gives you different perspectives. And I think, from, if you never leave the classroom, you don't get a look from the outside. And I think that your experiences coming in and out of teaching a couple of times, really informed you in ways that, you might have not seen otherwise.
Well, it definitely provided. One of the things that I noticed is that the teachers when I was in Philadelphia, the teachers who had been there for the duration had not really noticed how teaching had evolved, because it was a continuous process.
Right.
I'd been gone for 30 years, and I came back in, and it was like, whoa, wow, this is a whole different experience from what it was the first time around. And I mean, I not only could see the differences, I was being slapped in the face by them over and over and over all the time.
Wow. Yeah, I see what you mean. I think it's sort of like, leaving your neighborhood, and coming back after, 25 years. All of us, you see the differences that you might not have noticed it if you would just live there continuously. So, yeah. So let's talk about the book. First of all, about sort of the unusual process of how you guys started the book, about, how you re-met Roberta through Facebook.
It was, you were, up until that time, I had heard that people reconnected on Facebook, but I hadn't done it. But that Roberta found me, I think. Because I had been, one of the things that I did on Facebook fairly frequently was talking about how messed up I thought public education had become. And Roberta actually agreed with most of the positions that I was taking. And so she finally reached out and said, "Are you the George McDermott who was a teacher in Syosset?" And yeah, "Are you the Roberta Israeloff who was in my 11th grade track 1? And that's really how we got started. And we were really just exchanging ideas and exchanging perspectives and that sort of thing, without any intent to do anything except talk to each other and become reacquainted. And then sometime, I don't know when it was after we'd been talking for at least a year or two, Roberta said, "Do you think we should write a book?" And one of the problems when you're talking to a teacher, either your teacher or one of your former teachers or something like that, and you suggest a project, you're going to get taken up on it. I mean, teachers will always encourage a student or a former student to undertake any kind of project that exists.
Right.
Anything they think of.
Right.
So of course I said, yeah, sure. I think we should write a book. Yeah. What do you want to write it about? And we just continued. And
Yeah. But the interesting is that you continued for quite a while, and you decided to do it as an exchange of emails, which I thought was unusual.
well, we were English majors. English majors are, read Victorian novels, and
Right.
Victorian novels are frequently written in epistolary style. And,
Uh-huh.
and I mean, we debated other forms. We did actually talk about, what form, and we kept coming back to saying, well, why don't we just do it like letters? I mean, except instead of like emails, we'll do it like letters. And they will have been emails, but and once we made that decision, it sort of changed our perspective on the emails. But I mean, we knew that they were going to wind up in this book eventually. But which all that did really was make it so we were being a little more careful about the writing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. But they are letters. I mean, and certainly they're not, they're not, emails the way we think of them. They're, they're communicated as emails, but there's a thoughtful quality to it. And there's a response, and, you bring in other experiences. And so it's not just a Q&A between the two of you. There's a discussion to it. And it is interesting. It's sort of like, it is sort of like cutting back and forth, perspectives in a novel, and so I found that interesting, and I found it also very direct, and I found it compelling, and it sort of went from chapter to chapter. I think initially both of you were in chapters, and then sometimes you each took a chapter and responded to the other. So I thought it worked pretty well. Very interesting.
Well, the chaptering was sort of interesting because we didn't have chapters when we submitted the manuscript to
you didn't?
The publisher. Publisher said, well, we need chapters, and we need a table of contents, and and titles for each, and a title for each chapter. And we said, oh, you do? Oh, all right. So we went back and sort of divided the letters into chapters.
Right.
And that was another exercise. It was kind of fun. It was kind of, because we wound up changing some things as a result of that.
Right. Yeah, I think that when you structure it, I think it sort of gives a sort of a definition that makes you rethink those things. But I thought it turned out well, and I thought that the chapter headings worked. So I thought that was worth the effort, George.
Well,
I mean, you have to do something for a publisher, right? He's going to, well, what's the chapter? And I guess even coming up with the titles forced you to think, well, okay, what's the essence of this conversation here? Yeah. So, So the first of our three conversations, I wanted to focus on sort of looking back at your early years with Roberta teaching, without nostalgia, just like, oh, what was and what's no longer there, but with a certain sense of discernment over the years. What are some of the things that jumped out? And one of the things that certainly struck me reading the book was your discussion with Roberta about critical thinking skills, a theme that you'd carry forward through the years. And so talk a little bit about that, George. How did you define those skills, and how did you aim to teach them?
Well, critical thinking is basically, it's just thinking for yourself, rather than relying on received wisdom, trying to examine issues, trying to examine texts, trying to examine ideas, and trying to come up with your own evaluation of those ideas and text. And it's not just thinking, it's really thinking. I mean, a lot of people, when they say think for myself, I'm going to take a position, and that position, they may not have thought through that position. They just say, okay, I think this is a cool position to take, or this is the position that my friends take, or this is the position the politicians I admire or the movie actors or whatever I admire take, and they just adopt that position. That's not critical thinking. That's not even thinking. The critical thinking is hard to do, and it's hard to teach. And I think it probably starts with the ability to distinguish between fact and opinion. And that's one of the things that English teachers have banged their heads against walls forever trying to figure out how to do. It's very hard because facts are facts whether they're true or not. Opinions are opinions whether they're accurate or not. But you can verify a fact. You cannot verify an opinion, and that's the only difference. But that's very hard for students to learn.
Right. Yeah, I think that you know, I was struck by that in your class because you know you had a very ambitious syllabus of poems and short stories and novels. I think it was American Lit. But it was your questions and your exams were always thought provoking, and they pushed you. So I think it's easy with literature to basically retreat into sort of secondary analysis of imagery and the structure and sort of what I call technical analysis, and basically critical analysis. But that to me didn't excite me. What excited me was your effort to really provoke us to think about whether, even though this was fiction, what was the truth behind this fiction and how did it relate to your life? So unfortunately, we need to take a quick break right now. But we'll get right back on this after the break, George. So folks, don't go anywhere. We'll be back in 2 minutes with much more from George McDermott. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back, folks. So we're talking with George McDermott, co-author of a fascinating book called What Went Right, about his teaching over many years with one of his students, Roberta Israeloff. So we have George today. We'll have Roberta back for one of our subsequent episodes. But before the break, we were talking about critical thinking skills, and we just started, to dive into that. So I wanted to continue along that discussion. And one of the things we were talking about is that it is a tough thing that I think that you've experienced in education too, what you call sort of critical thinking skills versus a transfusion model of education, of just giving information to students and expecting them to just absorb them. So I want to just talk a little bit more about that, and what that meant to you in terms of your aim in teaching, and how did you provoke people to get involved in critical thinking?
The way teachers do everything is by asking questions. And I think actually the best story I've got for critical thinking happened in a class. It was not your class, it was another class. And I got the impression over the first couple of weeks of class that they were a little too passive. They were a little too willing to accept what authority figures like me said. So I said, okay, we're going to do, I think it was Ethan Frome, the novel Ethan Frome. I said, and I think probably the most efficient way to do this novel is for me to just lecture the way a college professor was lecturing. You guys take notes, and then we'll get through it real quickly, and then we can have a quiz, and we can move on to the other stuff in the curriculum.
Right.
And they just sort of very dutifully took notes. And what I told them was in the lectures was the most preposterous analysis I could come up with. There was absolutely no defense. There was no critical thought that would allow anyone to come up with those ideas for that novel. But I said all that stuff, and I got maybe halfway through, maybe a third quarter through the novel, and I said, okay, we're going to have an intermediate quiz here, and I want you guys to just, we'll schedule it for Monday, and you guys study over the weekend, and we'll give you the quiz and stuff. And I gave them the quiz, and if they answered with the interpretation I had given them in those lectures, I marked the answers wrong because they were wrong. And I don't think anyone in the class passed that quiz, and they were really, really upset.
Mm-hmm.
And I told them, the fact that I said it doesn't mean it's right.
Mm-hmm.
If you didn't think it was right, did you agree with all those things I was? And they said, well, no, we didn't agree with all the things you were saying them. But the fact that I said it doesn't mean it's right. You have to look at it for yourself. And if you don't think it's right, ask me why what you think isn't right, or suggest what you think as an alternative or something. Right. So anyway, I did give them a chance. By the way, I did give them a chance to take the quiz over, and they did fine. And I said, okay, we'll count the real one.
Right.
But,
yeah.
But I think they learned the lesson. I mean, they were at least a lot less passive from that point on.
Right. Yeah. I think that. So that sort of leads me to talk about one of the things that you mentioned in the book, which is teaching as a subversive activity. Now, of course, we're not talking about subverting students or converting them to some ideology, but I think it does go to the notion of sort of pushing them into asking questions as opposed to just accepting answers, as what you just said.
Yeah. There was no political agenda, but what we tried to do was we tried to make it pretty clear that what we valued were the questions, not the answers.
Right.
At least not prepackaged answers, and that your duty as a student, when you're in high school or when you're in college or when you're in graduate school, or your duty as a functioning human being after you become an adult and are out on your own, is to ask questions, to evaluate things, to come up with ideas on your own. And like back to the idea of lifelong learning. Lifelong learning means admitting that you don't already know.
Right. Yeah, and I think it does. So it seems to be a balance. We've talked about this in our previous conversations too, about certainly that's a primary goal of really spurring people to critical thinking. The other side that we've talked about is that there is a place that you've talked about for examination of, is there a corpus of knowledge you should come out with from education? And I think that's something worth looking at. Well, what is that? What in terms of what kind of knowledge should we expect and should be leave should students leave with having learned?
I do believe that there is a common, for lack of a less inflammatory term, I do believe there is a common core. I do believe there are things everybody needs to know. And I mean, you need to know it just as a common experience that allows you to communicate from that common experience and build on it.
Right.
If there are grammar and usage things. I did manage to teach some grammar and usage even in the middle of this in the middle of this critical thinking thing. I remember teaching. I can't remember what it was. I actually asked Roberta at one time. Did I ever actually teach participles And she said, yeah, as a matter of fact, you did teach participles.
Right. Right.
But there are things you need to know. And there's even the what they call the canon, all those dead white male authors that are people. I think the reason it's the canon is that they're good. I mean,
Right.
Shakespeare was not a shabby writer.
Right. Right.
Neither was Milton, neither was Faulkner, neither was Fitzgerald. They were all pretty good writers.
Yeah.
Which is why they're in the canon. What has changed is that there should be more people in the canon. It's not that the ones who are there shouldn't be. It's that we should also have more women. We should have more minorities. We should have more voices.
Right. Right. Yeah, I totally agree with you, and I think that. So for me, it was not surprisingly. I was an English major in college, so I was more interested broadly in literature, not just English, but nevertheless. I felt that it was important to have a canon, sort of a common experience of our heritage. But I also felt pretty strongly about language and the structure of language. And that, I guess, it made me sort of feel like an old fogey, but I did think that knowing the structure was important. And there are certain things that still, bug me. For example, people say, well, between you and I, when I'm like, no, it's, I know you think it sounds more elegant to say between you and I, but do you understand the objective case? And so I think that structure is important. And I don't regret being, your reviewing of things like participles. To me, it was like, and earlier in my, studenthood, diagramming sentences, which I felt, was useful, to understand the structure of why things fit. I mean, part of it was I was also very interested in science. So seeing that structure was like, well, this is interesting. This makes sense. And it helped me make sense of language. And I think that those things, I do think that some of that has been lost. I think that along with, with my son's age, they don't teach script anymore, right? They don't teach handwriting. And I think so some things are lost by being I don't want to say too liberal, that's not the right word, but just by letting go of some of the discipline.
Well, I think teachers today actually have a harder time than I had, and in either of the times that I was teaching. I mean, it was harder the second time through than it was the first time through, and for the same reason that I'm about to mention, which is the ascendancy of social media, the ascendancy of texting, at first email and then texting. They are linguistically sloppy.
Right.
Social media posts are sloppy.
Right.
Emails tend to be sloppy. Texts tend to be defined. They tend to be the working definition of sloppy. I did not allow students to use the capital letter U instead of U. I did not allow them to use the numeral 4 instead of FOR. I did not, and I think people need to know standard. I do think people need to know standard usage and standard English. But I mean, you depart from it. I mean, God knows I depart from it in my writing, but I do it intentionally, rather than through ignorance.
Right. Yeah, and I think that some things have changed over the years. I remember sort of when I was growing up with you. I mean, you never started a sentence with a conjunction, right? You never started with but or and of course that's become, everybody does that, including good writers, journalists. You're breaking the rules, but there's a reason for it, and there's a sense of emphasis that makes sense. So that's kind of you can evolve in certain ways, and I certainly there's some word usages which used to bother me, and I remember um, I'll mention one of them, which was to impact something, right? I mean, we tend to turn nouns into verbs, right? And that's, I don't know if that started with sports talk or whatever, but basically, I remember one of my mentors, a man who William Zinser, who wrote on writing well, talking to him, years ago, and he said, "Listen, I've just given up on some things. Let it go. Let impact be a verb. It's there.
The one that I've given up resisting is incentivize.
Okay.
All right. All right. If you don't want to say give them an incentive, that's fine. It's okay. You can say I'll incentivize them.
Right. Right. Yeah. So yeah, I do think that you can basically, you can balance rigor with innovation and and a new inventiveness in language. But I did appreciate your sticking to some of these things that because I think that that there is something to sloppiness of writing sort of is about sloppiness of thinking. I think that and there is something to when people have an idea about something, and my response is, what, write that down, send that to me. And if you can write it down and it makes sense, then you've thought it through, then it makes sense. The writing does make a difference, as opposed to just communicating something orally.
There was a group that I joined when I was in Philadelphia, which was it's a national group, and we had a Philadelphia chapter called, it was the Philadelphia Writing Project, which is a which is, this thing keeps cutting out. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, the Zoom. Yeah. So we got you, George. Yeah, you're in Philadelphia Writing Project.
And one of their principles was that learning to write is one thing, but you can also write to learn. And that's sort of what you just said, which is if you can write it down and communicate it to me, that'll help you learn it.
Right. Yeah. Now, one of the things that I want to talk about too was just you did have a profound effect on me as a teacher. I had good teachers, but I think that there are special teachers, and I think that they're, whatever you want to say about teachers, I do think that everybody has experiences with teachers that affected them in profound ways and positive ways. I mean, I guess there's some negative ones, but basically you remember your teachers. So I wanted you to talk about the importance of teachers because it's often, a tricky role. You're balancing, your instructor, you're a mentor, you're some, people sort of look at you as in a parental way. How did you see yourself as a teacher, and did that change over the years?
Yeah, it changed. The first teaching job I had was actually before Syosset. It was in a school in upstate New York, and I was teaching middle school instead of high school, 7th grade and 9th grade. And it was a school where it was a combined junior senior high, and there were kids. It was not an urban school. It was not even really a suburban school. It was basic. It was pretty much a rural school. There were seniors in that school who were as old as I was, almost. I mean, it was the first job I had after I graduated from college. So I was a year young for my class. So I think I had just turned 21 when I started teaching in that school.
Wow.
And there were kids there who were 19.
Wow.
And so at that school, it was hard to think of myself as a teacher, not as a contemporary. By the
Mm.
time I got to Syosset, I could think of myself as a teacher, but but I knew that I wasn't that much older than you guys,
Mm-hmm.
and I was sort of in the older brother category, able to like share experience and give advice from that perspective. I
Right.
thought.
Right. Right. Yeah. So, George, we're going to take another short break. But when we come back, we'll be talking much more with George McDermott. I want to continue talking to him about teachers because there's a lot to say about that. And I want to share some of my own reflections about teaching and my being a student with him. So, folks, don't go away. We'll be right back with much more from George McDermott. Poet and writer and co-author of a fascinating book called What Went Right? Lessons from Both Sides of the Teacher's Desk. And before the break, we was talking with George about just the role of teachers and, you know, the sort of the multiple roles they take. And George was talking about, you know, sort of his perspective over time being changed and just commenting on the difficulty teachers have today in many ways. So let's continue that discussion, George. How has that changed?
I think teachers are being blamed for the failures of education and not credited for the successes of public education. I think teachers today are having a much harder time than I was having when I was teaching. I'm continuously astounded by the ability of teachers to bear up under the pressures that they're under. And it was not, I mean, it was already bad. And then the COVID pandemic hit, and that made it even worse. Teachers are in an almost impossible position today, I think, and it's partly a result of the pressures on public education itself, not just on the teachers, but on the entire institution of public education. There's a group. I now live in Florida, and there's a group in Florida called the Florida Bats, BATS, which stands for Badass Teachers. and the Florida Bats sort of summarize the situation by saying that there is a group of self-labeled education reformers who have basically three objectives in their agenda, which are underfund, undervalue, and overtake. And it's what you do is you cut the funding for the schools, you undervalue the teachers and the things that they're trying to accomplish. And then when they fail, which they inevitably will, because you're not giving them the resources they need in order to succeed, right. You then take over the schools and privatize education, which is probably the objective. They're probably trying to get it out of public and into the private sector. And the teachers are the only point of resistance to that, because they're instead of trying to get rid of public education, they're trying to enact it.
Right. Yeah, I do think that there are just a lot of pressures that, well, I didn't feel them when I was in high school on teachers, and that you were able to take, I don't want to say take chances, but you were able to basically try things that I think would be difficult to do today. And so I recall that, in one of my previous conversations with you, I said to me, that there was, from my perspective as a student, in this hierarchical relationship with teachers, there was one, there was reading, writing, arithmetic, and then there was this, what I call the fourth R, which was really important to me, which was respect. And that's what I felt from, the good teachers that I had was they respected me enough to basically take chances and learning, basically to look at questions that I might have not have looked at. And, I got this in classes, and I got it as well. So I was the editor of my high school paper. And we, at that time we had an ambitious, publishing. We published every other week. And it was like being on a sports team. It was really a very serious effort. And I remember um, the my high school advisor, a man named Ron Barry, who you might recall from years ago, who later became a dean, which was put him in an interesting position of both being an English teacher and a dean. But there was a particular article that I had in the paper, and the student who wrote it. This is late '60s, so it was about a demonstration that got violent, and he was describing it. And at one point, he used an expletive, which was clearly not looked upon fondly by the administration. But so I had a long discussion with him about it, and I felt, well, I knew that this was not going to be looked upon kindly, but I felt that it was important to the article. It was important to what the story was about. So I let it go through, and then the advisor, Mr. Barry, came to me, and he just, in his very low key way, he looked over the pages before they were submitted to the printer, and he sort of looked at this, he flagged it, and he said to me, "You saw this?" I said, "Yeah." "Well, you want to talk to me about it?" So we had a long discussion about it, and he said, "We know what's going to happen, right?" And I said, "I have a pretty good idea." He said, "Okay, as long as you know." And it went through, and the usual um, uh, explosions, happened, but he backed me up. He sat there, and in the office of the principal and the assistant principal and the supervisor, and it, he defended me. He didn't, and so it was that kind of experience, that kind of respect for student inquiry, that was really important, and it really shaped, how I felt about education, in the best sense.
That's yeah, that's emblematic. I think that's exactly what I think teachers were trying to do back then and are still, and when they're doing it right, that's what they'd like to be doing now. Um, I think there's less time to do that because you have all these tests that you have to be preparing students for.
Right.
But but yeah, one of the words that comes up a lot in educational theory is inquiry.
Hmm.
That's what you're trying to stimulate among your students. Whether you're talking, that's especially true in English. It's especially true in social studies or history. It's especially true in any of the social sciences or the humanities. But I think it can also be true in math. I think it can also be true in sciences. I think what you're trying to do is get kids interested in trying to find answers, or at least to explore the questions. And and uh, if that means using vocabulary that's going to get them in trouble when they print it in their newspaper, then okay, that's okay, as long as they know it's going to get them in trouble,
Right.
you know,
Right.
and they're prepared for that. Sure.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think that one of the difficulties too, that for teachers, is that you're working with students and you're teaching them, and inescapably you're a role model in ways to them, and they're at a time of life where they're growing, they're learning, they're you know learning things in life. They're adolescents, they're young people. um and I think one of the difficulties is that, and you weren't that much older than we, but you said, yeah, sort of an older brother sort of sensibility. But I think that, one of the words that we'll come back to, I'm sure, in our future episodes is just, what you talk about in the book about trying to teach students what it means to be human.
Mhm.
And I think that that's a really valuable idea, but difficult. And I think that there's pressure on teachers now not to do that. Just stick to the curriculum. Just, stick to the facts, man.
Well, when you say you're trying to teach students to be human, and yes, Roberta and I both came back multiple times to that whole idea of trying to teach humanity, trying to teach the human experience, trying to prepare students to be functional adults. That's really what you're saying. You want them to be functional when they're out there. You
Right.
want them to be able to uh, you can't know what challenges they're going to face in their future, but you can teach them the kind of analytical thinking and the creative problem solving techniques that will allow them to deal with what they're facing.
Right.
And that's what you're trying to do.
Right. Right. And I think, I think you mentioned the book, and then you also mentioned in conversations I think I've had with you, um, that, just you also have this role that that is just there, and you influence students in ways you don't even know until years later. So I remember you were tell me, just relate that experience you had with the student that you mentioned to me, that you realized that he came back to you and you had had no idea the kind of influence you had, and that he was sort of a quiet student at the back of the class. You weren't didn't know much about him, but I think that's an interesting thing.
Well, there were two, and the one who was the quiet student in the back of the class was the one who figured out what was going on in the movie 2001.
Huh.
Um, the we did try to teach kids not just print literature, but also movies and that sort of thing. So we took I think probably most of Syosset High School went to go see 2001, the
Hmm.
movie, and we got into discussions afterwards, and we discussed it much the same we would have discussed a novel, but nobody was able to figure out why the computer was named Hal. But this one kid said, I think I know. And we said, okay, why? And he said, well, if you count back each letter from IBM, you get HAL.
Hmm.
And everybody said, whoa, I bet that's right. And I think that was the first. I mean, this kid had never raised his hand in all the months before we went to see that movie. And I can tell you from a teacher's perspective, if you're a student and you have never raised your hand, if you raise your hand to make a contribution, you will be called on. You're
Right.
guaranteed you will be
Right.
called on.
Right. Right. Right.
But there are students who have told me things that they remember from my class that I don't remember ever doing.
Right.
I remember one student told me that he remembered my berating a class for bullying a girl in class. I said, I feel like I should take off 5 points from all of your averages simply for being bullies.
Hmm.
And I don't remember doing that. I remember that I have always been anti-bullying, but I don't remember. But he remembered it. He remembered it 30 years later.
Wow.
So it
Yeah.
must have made an impression on him.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the rule is, I think you can count on 10% of what you say, but you never know which 10% it's going to be.
Right. 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 Well, there's much more to talk about, but I think we're going to have to bring our today's conversation to a close. I'm just grateful that we're going to have two more, and hopefully with Roberta back. Um, there's much more I want to talk to you about. With a notion you talked about experiential learning, and some instances that I was involved with Roberta on that. But anyway, so I just wanted to thank you very much, George, for a very incisive conversation today. And remember, this is just the first of our trilogy over the next 2 months. If I just want to mention, Friends, if you missed today's conversation with George McDermott, you can still listen to it as a podcast on voiceamerica.com to search for my show 45 Forward. You can also find it on Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or go to my website, roelresources.com, and just click on the 45 Forward tab. So be sure to join me next Monday, 12 noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern Time, when I'll be talking with Guido Durley, the founder of MX Elder Care, who will talk about his mission to guide families through each step of the Medicaid application process so they can secure the best personalized long-term care for their loved ones. And look for our future episodes with George and Roberta, hopefully in the next couple of months.